As most of you possibly know, I'm going to discuss communicative aspects of conceptual integration. First, I will outline main thesis of anthropocentric linguistics, which gives us insight into the existence of human languages. Then I will present a basic conceptual integration network and basic rules of conceptual integration at the example of the compound SARS-CoV. I will also present a modified model of communicative aspects of blending of conceptual integration. I will share the screen to show you my presentation. So I have to stop the video, I suppose. I don't know, I have clicked on share the screen and I don't know whether it works. Can you tell me whether you can see the slides or not?
Так, все видно, все чудово.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll switch on the slideshow. So I think it's better now. According to the anthropocentric theory of human languages, proposed by Franciszek Grucza and Sambor Grucza, languages really exist exclusively in form of idiolects, so-called idiolects. Idiolects are defined as intrinsic properties of particular individuals, more precisely as intrinsic syntactic, phonological, and referential properties of brains of particular people. Each human disposes of a certain genetically determined potential. This potential enables each human to develop their individual language properties, to develop their own idiolect. People internalize, they acquire their idiolects when they get confronted with texts or utterances constructed and materialized, written or spoken by other people, other individuals. On this basis, on the basis of these texts and utterances, they learn to reconstruct the meaning of the utterances and they acquire knowledge and skills which are necessary to construct their own texts. So, idiolects are really existing properties of particular people, of their mental sphere. As it comes to such notions as the Ukrainian language, the Polish language, the English language, they do not refer to real properties of concrete people, but to intellectual or ideal constructs. Such intellectual constructs can be defined as logical sums of all language properties of all participants belonging to a given speech community. This means that the designate of the expression the English language, understood as a logical sum, does not really exist. So the designate of the expression, the English language, if we understand it as a logical sum, does not really exist, because none of the people taken into consideration can have developed all the language properties of their speech community. So we all differ as it comes to our language properties. Even if we all speak Polish, if we all speak Ukrainian or English, we all differ. This means that such a set of language properties, logical sum, will also include properties which haven't been developed by all members of the relevant speech community. But I'd like to underline that expressions such as the Polish language, the English language, may refer to really existing languages as far as they are defined not as logical sum, but as cross-sections. This means that only properties developed by all the members of the speech community are taken into consideration. Only properties developed by all the members of the community are researched. Those properties, those language so if we interpret such an expression like the Polish language as a cross-section, we take into consideration only such language properties which are shared, which are common to all the participants of this speech community. In the light of the anthropocentric paradigm, materialized written or spoken texts do not contain any knowledge. They do not contain any meaning. The only thing they contain is some ink on a piece of paper, which, and this ink takes on a specific form. This form is based on convention. It makes language signs, letters, words, phrases recognizable, and therefore it enables people to attribute to them some specific concrete value. Meanings are values attributed by people to concrete materialized texts. As such, meanings exist exclusively in people's brains or minds. They don't exist inside of materialized texts. Meanings emerge in the process of conceptual integration. Now I am going to present the way conceptual integration is accomplished in our brains, or perhaps better, by our brains. Different meaning potentials of words and expressions are activated as parts of linguistic structures and compound expressions. Compounds are based on conceptual juxtaposition of at least two elements. I'm going to show it at the example of the compound SARS-CoV and SARS-CoV-2, perhaps. So compounds are based on conceptual juxtaposition of at least two elements. Their meanings are more complex. They cannot be simply predicted from some of the constituent parts. as in the case of SARS-CoV or SARS-CoV-2. Apart from semantic values or perhaps semantic features directly derivable from individual parts of a compound, the meanings of the compounds contain non-derivable information which emerges in a given context. So this information cannot be derived from the individual parts of a compound. In order to capture the essence of this emergence, of the phenomenon of conceptual integration, of meaning formation and correlations hidden behind them, I would like to refer to the so-called conceptual blending theory or the conceptual integration theory, the CIT. The theory was founded jointly by Gilles Fauconnier and Mark Turner in the year 2002. So I think it was first published in 2002. The theory has been further developed and refined by other contemporary linguists, such as Brandt, Oakley, and Coulson. The CIT, the conceptual integration theory, highlights the dynamic and emergent character of the formation of meaning. Thus, it seems to be an all the more appropriate theoretical framework for the analysis of formally complex neo-semantic and partially neologic expressions, such as SARS-CoV and SARS-CoV-2. So the theory also allows us to analyze more complex expressions, not only superficially simple compounds, but also more complex expressions. The CIT is based upon the concept of mental spaces proposed by Gilles Fauconnier in 1985. Mental spaces have been defined as small conceptual packets construed as we think and talk for local understanding and action. I'll repeat because it may seem a little bit complicated. Mental spaces are defined as small conceptual packets. So they constitute a kind of pieces of knowledge, small conceptual packets, which are construed in the moment we think and talk for local understanding and action. I will present you a basic structure, a model of a basic conceptual integration network at the example of the compound SARS-CoV. Please look at the slide, at the presentation. All you see are mental spaces. So the generic space, input 1, input 2, and blended space. Mental spaces are linked on the basis of the so-called partial cross-space mapping. Cross-space mapping connects respective counterparts in the input spaces, so in input 1 and in input 2. Cross-space mapping means constructing a partial match between two input mental spaces. The essence of conceptual integration is to project selectively from those inputs into a novel blended mental space. And this mental space, the novel blended mental space, develops emergent structure. It develops this meaning of the whole compound that cannot be predicted from input 1 or input 2. The whole process is very dynamic. A blended space connects relevant elements from both inputs and integrates them so that new features emerge that are specific for the blend. And as I already said, at the same time, non-derivable from any of the inputs. To make it clear once more, two input spaces reflect salient elements of two distinct events, things, or phenomena, and they are reflected by input 1 and input 2. In conceptual integration, respective counterparts in both inputs are interlinked on the basis of cross-space mapping, and they are selectively projected into a new blended space. For example, in the case of SARS-CoV, only relevant selected features from both inputs are taken into account. I mean such morphological or functional features that enable the coronavirus to cause the SARS syndrome, the so-called SARS syndrome. Mechanisms of cross-space mapping and selective projection connect the topologies of the inputs. Topologies of the inputs are just conceptual structure of the inputs. So these mechanisms cross-space mapping connect the topologies of the inputs. Such topological interblend appears in the blended space and generates emerging structure. So perhaps look at the slide once more. I will describe the slide. Input 1 reflects a range of knowledge concerning the SARS syndrome, which means the effect of coronavirus infection. Whereas knowledge concerning the cause, the coronavirus itself, is represented by input 2. The mechanism of cross-space mapping connects the cause with the effect. They are projected to the blended space, where the cause is compressed to the effect. And in this way, a novel blend emerges called SARS-CoV, coronavirus, which causes the SARS syndrome. The integration network is not a two-space entity. It accounts for a dynamic aspect of meaning construction. And for this reason, the so-called generic space, it's here on top. For this reason, the so-called generic space must be activated. It is a more schematic frame containing shared characteristics of the input spaces. At this point, it seems necessary to briefly define the notion of frame, because I said that the generic space is a kind of frame containing characteristics the input spaces have in common. Frame semantics was developed by Charles Fillmore. It is a theory of linguistic meaning. The basic idea is that a word evokes or activates a whole frame of semantic knowledge related to the notion to which the word refers. So, one cannot reconstruct the meaning of a word without access to the knowledge that refers to this word. For example, we could not understand the word SARS-CoV without knowing anything about viruses, about the SARS syndrome, about doctors, the relations between doctors, the relations between infection and viruses, etc., etc. Excuse me, could you tell me whether you can hear me? Because I can see the presentation, but I cannot see you anymore. Can you hear me? Okay, I think you can hear me. So I repeat, we could not understand the word SARS-CoV. Excuse me, I have messed up the presentation. Just give me a minute, please. Excuse me. So we could not understand the word SARS-CoV without knowing anything about viruses, about the SARS syndrome, about the relations between doctors and patients, the relations between infection and viruses, etc. According to frame semantics, meaning is always interlinked with knowledge, and a frame is a piece or perhaps a range of knowledge larger than meaning itself, the meaning of a single word. And this range of knowledge is indispensable to understand a given word. As I have mentioned before, the generic space contains characteristics that inputs have in common. As you can see, in this case, the generic space reflects the frame of lower respiratory tract disease because it comprises the disease itself, its severe or benign course, as well as pathogens causing this disease. So it comprises elements from both inputs. I would like to underline once more that the frame of lower respiratory tract disease was considered relevant because specific symptoms, effects, and course of the SARS infection attributed to the SARS input and the relevant properties of the CoV input manifest themselves at the level of this frame, of the frame of lower respiratory tract disease. The conceptual elements mentioned above are contained in both inputs. They provide a link between the inputs. They constitute a structural foundation for the blend called SARS-CoV. And I would like to emphasize that generic spaces are really firmly anchored in existing conceptual structure. They provide a strong conceptual link to the actual knowledge of the conceptualizer and a template for future blends at the same time. Mental spaces mentioned above are linked with the blended space or the blend, or just the blend. In the blend, selected elements from the inputs are integrated into a novel structure and mentally simulated in order to experiment with various framings, with various ranges of knowledge, with various contexts. It seems to be of great importance in reference to scientific experiments. If we want to generate knowledge concerning, for example, viruses, we are forced to experiment with different aspects of meaning of relevant notions. Constructing scientific hypotheses relies significantly on experimenting with meanings, on closing conceptual gaps by means of meaning construction. The blend demands particular attention because it generates meaning aspects which are non-derivable from the meaning of respective elements inherited from the inputs. So it's something more, the meaning of the blend is something more than the meaning of the inputs, of its constituent parts. In general, the blend does not contain any emergent meaning. It comprises dynamic online simulation processes which lead to the emergence of a relatively fixed meaning. It needs to be underlined that the blended space remains connected to the inputs by the mappings. So the mappings connect the blend, the existing blend, the blended space, to the inputs, so that real inferences from the blended space can be transmitted to the inputs and computed in the inputs. So real inferences which we gain in the blended space can be computed in the inputs. They are just fed back to the inputs and they are computed there. For example, scientists researching viruses may deduce that certain specific features of the SARS-CoV virus result from its morphological structure, and more precisely, they project the inferences from the blended space, from the blend, into the input CoV, so into input 2, which stands for coronavirus. We can also interpret the emotions of SARS patients and their families in terms of the familiar emotions linked to the frame, to the input of the SARS syndrome, to input 1. The topology, the conceptual structure of each mental space in a given conceptual integration network is determined by a set of conceptual relationships called vital relations, such as cause-effect, as you can see in the case of SARS-CoV. Vital relations are also identity, change, part-whole, analogy, property, etc. Even the emotional background, the emotional load hidden behind one or both frames, both inputs may function as a vital relation connecting them, as it may be in the case of SARS-CoV-2. The emotional load of some texts on SARS-CoV-2 is significant, as we all know. Interspatial relations of this type connect corresponding elements from the inputs, providing a foundation for selective projection into the blend. In other words, the blend and the inputs set up so that useful topology in the inputs, so useful conceptual structure in the inputs, and the outer space relations are reflected by inner space relations in the blend. For example, the inner space relations of the blend SARS-CoV, coronavirus that causes the SARS syndrome, where cause is compressed to effect, are based on the outer space relations between input 1, reflecting the effect, reflecting SARS, and input 2, representing the cause, the coronavirus. The conceptual integration process allows us to achieve compressions of vital relations, which determine the creativity of the blend. Compression patterns, typical for a given blend, allow us to capture its character and the way it functions in different contextual conditions. Due to conceptual blending, and it is one of its central benefits, we are able to provide compressions to human scale. We establish mental spaces, connections between them, and blended spaces for some specific purposes. Gilles Fauconnier claims that it gives us human scale understanding, global insight, and new emergent meaning. It makes our way of thinking both efficient and creative. The most important aspect of our efficiency and creativity is their conceptual compression, which we achieve through blending. Certain conceptual relations, such as cause-effect, identity, and change, are typical. They nearly always show up in compression under blending. Compression maximizes and intensifies vital relations. Conceptual integration, the whole process of conceptual integration and the conceptual integration capacity provides people with the ability to do really remarkable and complex compressions. And every language systematically provides different types of compression. So our languages, our idiolects provide us different types of compression. Become conventional because they are highly useful and they are associated with specific grammatical forms. For example, noun-noun compounds like boathouse, adjective-noun combinations like angry man, noun-adjective combinations like child-safe or sugar-free, So these are specific English compounds. I regret to give you any examples in the Ukrainian language. It is the mechanism of compression that makes the compound SARS-CoV a functional template for communication and for specialized communication. To sum up, formal complexity of compound expressions such as SARS-CoV, SARS-CoV-2 results from the interplay of multidimensional conceptual operations that lead to the actual meaning of such compounds. Considering names of scientific notions, the juxtaposition of two or more compounds' formal elements is based on projection of selected conceptual components derived from different frames into the emerging conceptual blend. Particular relations connecting these conceptual elements manifest themselves in specific situational and contextual conditions, and they lead to the emergence of a novel meaning. The scope of meaning reaches far beyond the semantic value directly derivable from any of the mental elements of the other sum. The conceptual background of the compound's complexity is therefore implicitly reflected in its formal shape at the linguistic level. Communicative aspects of conceptual integration are reflected in the modified framework of conceptual integration presented by Rafał Augustyn and Ewelina Prażmo. The model you can see on the slide has been developed by Rafał Augustyn and Ewelina Prażmo on the basis of the contextual blending models proposed by Brent, Oakley, and Carlson. These approaches differ slightly as it comes to the nomenclature, but both emphasize the pragmatic embedding of the conceptual integration process in the discourse and the communicative relevance. The discursive aspect of blending process wasn't taken into consideration in the original CIT model proposed first by Fauconnier and Turner. The conceptual integration model, revised by Augustyn and Prażmo, uses 6 spaces, and I will briefly discuss these spaces. The blending process is initiated in the discourse space. It's on top to the left. The authors assume that the actual cognitive takes place in the discourse space. It is a basis for further space-building processes, and it may be defined as a space which represents the acts of the discourse participants. I mean acts of engaging in discourse and construing meaning. Other mental spaces are interconnected with the discourse space. The reference space reflects the discourse topic at the moment of linguistic communication. It reflects actuality. The presentation space is a predicating space. It can be somehow figurative, but it usually also contains some schematic structure. The inputs function in a slightly different way, and for this reason, they are a little bit asymmetrical. The blended space reflects the integration of selected elements from the two inputs, reference space and presentation space. It is a simulation space. So the blended space, yes, the blended space is a simulation space where the conceptualizer can mentally access different elements from the inputs and, what is important, try out different hypothetical scenarios, different framings, different frames of the relevant elements from the inputs. However, the mental simulations at this level are unstable. They are not yet firmly fixed, and there is still no emergent meaning. So the blended space does not contain the fixed emergent meaning. In fact, different framing scenarios may be taken into consideration during this mental simulation phase. However, the framing of the inputs is contextually determined. So we can take into consideration different frames, different ranges of knowledge. Yes, it's possible, but the framing of the inputs is always determined by the context, by the concrete context. The process of framing the inputs is open-ended and reciprocal. It is an online dynamic process, which means that alterations, changes in the course of a mental simulation can happen, and changes in one space can influence the framing of the other spaces. The shared structure, the structure that the inputs have in common, is captured here not by the generic space, but by the relevance space. The relevance space determines what is situationally and contextually relevant, and it depends on the goal and purpose of the discourse participants. The framing of the blend depends on all the background knowledge. For example, the relevance space contains relevant knowledge internalized by the discourse participants. It provides the relevant range of knowledge for the framing of the blend. At the pragmatic level, the relevance space is responsible for the emergence of reasonable inferences. You can also see the elaboration space. The elaboration space reflects the active and available blend, which enables creative elaboration of the blend depending on the pragmatic relevance. In other words, it is a properly framed blend where the meaning emerges only in the interpretation structured by the relevance space. The meaning which is produced in the blend results from the synergy, which emphasizes the pragmatic nature of meaning creation. The contextual models of conceptual blending highlight the simple pragmatics for successful meaning construction. Grasping the relevance makes it possible to understand what the speaker means. The authors of this revised CIT model emphasize that the process of conceptual integration is actually never closed. It is rather an open-ended and recursive operation, as the inferences that emerged in the elaborated blend may be fed by the conceptualizer back to the current discourse and become subject of further integration process. So it really seems to be an open-ended process, an open-ended operation. The authors of this model, Rafał Augustyn and Ewelina Prażmo, argue that this is especially the case with neo-concepts, so novel concepts or new senses linked to a specific linguistic form, just as in the case of SARS-CoV. Such neo-concepts circulate frequently in the discourse for a certain period of time. They experience different modifications until they become accepted by a given in a relatively stable conventional meaning. Referring to the anthropocentric paradigm of human languages and of human language knowledge, I will propose a slightly modified six-space model anchored not only in the original four-space integration network proposed by Fauconnier and Turner, but also in the contextual approach to conceptual blending. The revised approach shall consider the specificity of languages for special purposes and specialized human knowledge, along with ontological conditions of human mental processes in general and conceptual integration in particular. As opposed to the model presented before, the entire conceptual integration process is physically initiated not in the discourse space, but in the relevance space. All of the authors mentioned above locate discourse participants in the discourse space, whereas specialized knowledge, purpose, situational relevance should be located in the relevance space. It should, however, be noted that in the light of the ontology of human knowledge and human languages, each type of human knowledge is an intrinsic attribute of specific individuals' brains, be it declarative, procedural, or language knowledge. So each type of human knowledge is an intrinsic attribute of specific individuals' brains. More specifically, the processes of synaptic transmission involved in conceptual blending at biological level begin in brains of particular individuals. So the synaptic transmission which grounds the conceptual blending at biological level, begins in brains of particular individuals, not in an unspecified space between them. In the light of the anthropocentric linguistics, discourse is defined as making use of texts by particular participants of a particular communicative interaction in order to attain a specific communicative goal. I'll describe it once more. Discourse is a specific communicative situation where people, concrete people, use texts, materialized spoken or written texts, in order to attain a specific communicative goal. To perform discourse acts, individuals acquire specific abilities referred to as discursive competence. I therefore propose to consider discursive competence as a capacity of each individual to put a set of specific goal-directed constraints on each act of using specialized texts. Consequently, acts of creating texts and acts of using them in a discursively determined way should be conceptually separated. What is more, discursive competence internalized by individuals must be conceptually distinguished from specific discourse acts. Furthermore, specialized language, as well as communicative competence, seems to be a component of the discursive competence. And for this reason, I suggest to place specialized discourse participants, their specialized knowledge, their background knowledge, their language knowledge, and their discursive competence in the relevance space, not in the discourse space, but in the relevance space. The discourse space should comprise specific discourse acts performed by only specific discourse acts performed by discourse participants. This kind of conceptual differentiation between the discourse space and the relevance space seems necessary as potential relevance of inferences examined by discourse participants before the inferences are fed back to the subject of discourse. So, the inferences must reach the relevance space before they are fed back to the discourse space. What is more, from the ontological perspective, inferences do not circulate in the discourse space at all, and the model of Augustin and Prajmo suggests they do. The only thing really present in the discourse space are materialized texts, written and spoken texts, created on the basis of these inferences. Inferences exist only in brains of discourse participants, whereas concrete texts, materialized on the basis of these inferences, exist in the discourse space. In the context of specialized communication, the elaboration space seems to play a vital role. It draws on a mentally available blend with a proper, firmly fixed frame. This frame activates the blend's novel meaning only in relation to contextual demands specified in the relevance space. This seems particularly relevant to the specificity of specialized discourse, where terms have firmly fixed contextual demands from the perspective of their semantic relations to other terms. They are firmly located within the conceptual system of a given theory. According to this revised CIT model, the recursive process of blending allows the conceptualizer to refer the inferences generated in the blend to the subject of the current specialized discourse. In accordance with the anthropocentric paradigm, such an act of reference can be performed not in the discourse space, but only in the relevance space, in relation to the specialized knowledge of discourse participants. And then, in consequence, it reaches the discourse space. Ladies and gentlemen, creativity and novelty are consequences of conceptual integration. But creativity and novelty depend on firmly anchored mental structures. As Fauconnier claims, people think in a conservative way. They always refer to mental constructs and material objects that are already available and known. Conceptual integration, too, has its conservative aspects. It uses generic spaces, input spaces, blending templates that are embedded in existing conceptual structure. I have demonstrated evidence of the central role of blending and compression in superficially simple constructions like noun-noun compounds, but it also concerns highly complex grammatical structures. Conceptual blending can produce new conceptual and formal structures which are well anchored at the same time. Blending mechanisms deliver expressions that are novel and intelligible because they are strongly anchored to existing constructions. When we hear or see an expression, we construct an integration network. But in order to do this, we have to do some selective projection that is not specified by what we hear. So there is room for creativity. There's always room for creativity. To sum up, from the linguistic perspective, I'd like to stress the fact that in the acts of communication, texts we produce, I mean not only specialized communication, I mean everyday situations. So in the acts of communication, texts we produce serve us to exert a kind of selective pressure on the mechanisms of conceptual compression in the brain of the recipient, of the text recipient. As text authors, we emphasize different meaning potentials of different expressions or phrases, different vital relations within the conceptual structure of notions. We do this so we construe texts in order to influence the recipient's process of understanding, so that it becomes more consistent with our communicative intentions. In other words, the form of each utterance exerts a selective pressure on the mechanisms of conceptual compression. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your attention. I would also like to say thank you to the interpreter. If you have any question, I will answer them with pleasure. Well, I would like to say that now I don't see any questions, but you discuss questions connected with economics and psychology. I would like to say, to stress the fact that this theory, the theory of conceptual integration, is very useful as it comes to the analysis of economical notions. For example, the metaphor of flow, of money flow. So thank you very much for your attention.
Большое спасибо, пани Анна. Уважаемые коллеги, у кого есть какие вопросы, прошу, вы можете включать микрофон, можно в чате обозначить ваши вопросы. Я думаю, что мы сейчас тут... О, Оксана Николаевна, я отключила перевод уже, да.
Спасибо.
Да. Угу. Пожалуйста, уважаемые коллеги. Ну, участники благодарят, да, пани Анну за сегодня.
All the participants, they are very much thankful to you, Pani Anna, Lady Anna, or Miss Anna. I should use English. Yeah, I remember. So thank you very much for that information. But I may see it was not actually easy, but it's really very, very hard theory as for me. But actually, it has some very interesting core, it's possible to say. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. So I know it seems quite theoretical, although
Я знаю, це було дещо знато теоретично. I will make the translation, Miss Anna, without. Now you may hear me. Please.
So I know it seems very theoretical. It's a hard theory, I must say.
Важка теорія, дійсно, я маю визнати, що складна інформація. І вона дійсно така складна.
Show you some simple examples.
Я старалася вам зробити певні спрощені приклади.
I hope it was understandable to a certain extent.
І я старалася вам це надати таким чином, щоб це було певним вже зрозумілим виглядом вам подало.
Thank you very much, Oksana, because I know it was hard work.
Oh, thank you too, my dear. Thank you very much. I tried all my best, but even for me it was not easy. Yes, I have to confess, but I hope it was even a bit understandable in my translation.
Surely.
Thank you.
Surely.
Thank you.
Да, спасибо большое, и тогда мы будем завершать сегодняшнюю встречу. Да. Всем участникам хотела бы напомнить, что у нас сегодня в 3 часа следующий вебинар, и обязательно переходите по ссылочке, которая вам была прислана, чтобы напоминания не отправлять еще раз. Да. Спасибо большое, пани Анна, и я думаю, что мы увидимся еще и не только с помощью вебинара, но и непосредственно уже в Польше.
Thank
I
you,
hope so
Hanyana.
too.
Thank you.
Да.
You understand? Okay, so I will not translate.
Thank you very
Спасибо
much for your
большое.
invitation.